So this is me starting from 0 on this gas cooker thing. And this is not going to be the complete modeling process for the high poly mesh because I think that's actually kind of boring to watch. We're going to talk a lot more about the low poly and the UVs and texturing and all that kind of stuff. But I wanted you to at least see part of the process here. So I've got the reference stuck up there on the screen so you can see where we're headed. It's, when you're getting going on it, it's important to get the proportions right, straight off the bat. I'm not a big believer in blocking stuff in necessarily, but I do like spending time at the beginning just to make sure you get the shapes and stuff right. There's certain aspects of this that are, that have a definite look to them, like that opening for the grate at the bottom and the ridging around the bottom base that we'll see get created here eventually. That raised piping that goes around the outer edge, that kind of stuff. So this high poly has a number of techniques that get used on it. There's everything, I think, honestly, from sub-D modeling to the rounded edge shader. There's floaters. There's mop booleans in here, mesh op booleans. Just lots of scripts getting fired off for various reasons. Like right there, we just fired off a quick pipe to add that rounded detail. And we're going to sub-D that, so we throw a quick bevel on the hard corners. And yeah, this just gives you a little look into my general process, although it's sped up obviously from my normal working speed. These teeth that get created here, this is actually something kind of interesting. I built these teeth several times. I built them like this, but this is not what actually ends up in the model at the end. This is these ended up being too big, and I futzed around with the shape of them way too much. You'll see that here eventually. It's just not cool. So what we ended up with in the end was a much simpler shape. You'll notice that I toggle the render there quite a bit. That's for checking checking what the model looks like overall with lighting hitting it, but also for verifying that the rounded edge shader is doing what I think it's doing. And it may not be apparent watching the video, what's happening, but I can tell when I'm working on it. It's just that that eye of experience. Yeah, I remember the bottom required a bit of fiddling to get things to look the way I wanted to. When you're dealing with the rounded edge shader, it's really more about how do the intersections fit together, because that will determine the quality of the edge rounding that you got. So here we're going to see some instancing. I'm going to make one tooth, or one ridge, I guess, and then instance that all the way around the base. I think what I'm doing here is I'm experimenting with different widths of the rounded edge shader, seeing what I want on each section. There's always a bit of fooling around. Just realizing now this thing has a bit of a Darth Vader helmet look to it, but that won't be forever. So there we go with the instancing. So we instance that tooth all the way around. And since we did that, we only have to work with the first tooth to adjust how things fit together. So you'll see that here once we get it's starting to chug a little bit, I think, because I have so many instances. But you can see now they're closer together at the bottom than they are at the top. So if I scale the top, I could tweak that fit to get it to be the way I want it to be. and just let the rounded edge shader kind of smooth everything together and you end up a cohesive whole. And I end up doing the same thing with the little feet that sit around the outside. I just make one and then instance it around so I can work with the shape over time. The way that I quickly hardened the bottom there, you saw that face snap to flat. That's if you go back and watch my lightweight sub D video, that'll explain what's going on there. That's just you're hitting it with a super hard edge weight. Same thing's going on here. Yeah, I really try to avoid sub D whenever I can these days. I just find it far too slow. Throwing some edge weights on things, much more expedient. Yeah, here's the aforementioned fooling around with the teeth that really didn't go anywhere. But this is all part of it. You play with stuff, you see what works, you see what doesn't work. Change things, you adapt. Sometimes you think you have a good idea, but it ends up being really terrible. Kind of like these teeth. Okay, here we're going to turn the main shell of or we have turned the main shell into a mesh out Boolean, and I'm going to subtract out the hole for the little handle just using a cylinder. This kind of thing is generally, at least to me, much faster than modeling that hole out and trying to get it to smooth correctly, by wrestling with edges all day. And this is just faster, cleaner, and more controllable, to be honest. So what I did there was I copied the subtractive brush, put it into another mesh item, and now we're going to use it as an additive element. So you cut the hole, take the same shape, and add into the hole again. But usually we'll scale it down a little bit just to make it have a gap so it looks like it's been inserted and that kind of thing. Yeah, there you go. And this is a little knobby thing that sticks out the side. I guess it must be for controlling the size of the flame or the amount of heat. Just some quick bevels, some insets. Add some ridging around the outside. We do the ridging a little differently in this one. We're not going to do instancing. We'll just do an ungrouped inset and extrude. I think this is getting near the end. Yeah, we're almost done. Once this part gets done playing, we'll jump over to the finished high poly mesh and talk about the differences on it and decisions that were made there. Okay, and warping ahead, this is what I ended up with in the end with the high poly mesh. Now, one thing I would like to point out, well, there's a number of things. Let's talk about each one. You can see that I've added a on the concept art. You can see it's got these lines that kind of run down, and I think he just drew those in to indicate that it was metal. But I thought it was kind of an interesting look if those were faceted. So I made a judgment call to put some harder seams in there. You can see as I spin this around, it's got those hard creased edges here and there, and that's really to just hopefully give it a faceted or like a more interesting look on the planar areas of the mesh. See, what else did we do? I made up a bottom section for the mesh. Maybe the theory is this little nozzle down here. I'm going to polygon mode. This little nozzle down here is where they could insert like butane containers to fill it back up or whatever. Up top, we made this outer ring a little fancier. We added some insets, added some floaters, some details, that kind of thing. And the main body, we added an extra cutout here with some venting on it. Now this doesn't look like anything here, but if I render this, you'll hear my computer kick up, and there's not too much I can do about that. But you can also see that with the rounded edge shader, now I'm getting that nice panel line along the top. That clearly indicates that's a separate piece that snaps on or whatever. So speaking of that, I talked about the rear of the prop and how we were going to make that a little more interesting. And what I chose to do there was to add an extra panel line that runs vertically down the back and has a couple of screw heads on it. That's really all it is. But this is the believability thing I was telling you about. That looking at this, your mind will be able to put together, okay, so you pop those screws off in the back, and then that'll give you access to maybe you get that ring off the top, and that's how you open up the body of it, that kind of thing. It's nothing complicated, but it all factors in to someone being able to buy in on some level when they look at the prop. Or maybe it's just a personal hang-up of mine, but it's something that was drilled into me very early on when I started doing 3D models, and I've always stuck with it. There's the top, and there's the new teeth. You can see we definitely went smaller on those, and we added some faceting on the sides. So, in terms of techniques, if I go into wireframe, you can see some of this stuff is much heavier than other stuff. So moving in here, all of these items here that I've selected, these are the floaters that I have going. There's floaters for bolts, for vent holes, for those things up top, and just anywhere that I need some detail to look like an inset, but I didn't want to model it in, that's a floater. And the normal map will pick those up as though they were modeled, and we'll see that eventually once we get to the baking section. The heavy dense stuff like this is generally mop Boolean. So you can see this cutout piece right here is a Boolean cut-in. That looks messy here, but when it renders out, it looks fine. And thanks to the rounded edge shader, I'm able to jam things together and have them all smooth out nicely. So I think that's all there is to say about the high poly mesh. I just wanted you to get the general idea, the general approach to how I would do it. And in the next section, we're going to start to talk about not only building the low poly, but how to think about approaching the low poly. So I'll see you in that section.